When it comes to matchups across fiction, people bring their favorite characters or just the strongest characters from their favorite verses and pair them up against other characters. And these characters may or may not have any similarities. So Goku and Superman, they have a lot of similarities, while Goku versus Saitama might not have as many similarities. There's also other matchups, for example, such as Naruto versus Ichigo, Iron Man versus Batman, so on and so forth. Most people don't necessarily need to be into power scaling to have these sorts of conversations. They could be literally anyone from any walk of life. But a lot of matchups do tend to be rather random, just due to how different the characters are when comparing them. And in this video, this is going to be a rather random matchup. As you can tell by the title, we're talking about Giorno Giovanna from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure and comparing him to my fucking glorious king, Astolfo, everyone's fucking favorite femboy. Now, since I've already spoke about Giorno, I'll just go over him more briefly. When we're discussing JoJo scaling, it's very weird, especially when it comes to the Pacific part. Part 5 is a pretty good example on that, since there's a lot of debunkable scaling that tries to scale, say, Giorno to previous stands. And I have done a Giorno debunk in the past, and just going over a lot of the ridiculous scales for GER. So you can watch that if you wish. I will go over the same points, but at least some of the same points, but just in less detail. I do recommend that video if you want more detail into what I'm going to talk about. But just to sum it up, firstly, GER does not have infinite or higher levels of speed, despite what JoJo fans and even things like Versus Battle Wiki try and argue for. Golden Experience Requiem does not reach levels of that speed or anything close. He most likely caps off in the MFDL ranges at most. Most people who try to argue GER having infinite or inaccessible levels of speed use the stand stats as their primary way of arguing this, but people need to understand that the stand stats don't necessarily scale to the physical capabilities unless specifically mentioned via the stand stat descriptions. And even then, the stat ranked as none doesn't necessarily mean that they are far beyond anyone else. It just means it's not really applicable to the stand's abilities or the capabilities of it. And it's just weird trying to see people argue this way. Again, I have brought up examples within the original Golden Experience Requiem video I did a few days ago. So if you want a more in-depth explanation on why, say, the stand stats is not a good way to actively scale or accurately scale Golden Experience Requiem, then just go watch that. I do recommend it. And there are other arguments for Giorno scaling extremely high, like, say, trying to scale Giorno to Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap, a Part 7 stand. But as I mentioned at the original GER video, a lot of those arguments are either just misinterpretations of guides like the Jojo Veller, or for the most part, baseless assumptions, since a lot of those scales try and scale Golden Experience Requiem to D4C via these ultimate stand statements. But even then, that these ultimate stand statements need to be taken in context. And even if you do take them in context, you realize that Journo does not scale to Funny Valentine, especially since these characters are in completely separate universes despite being in the same franchise, and therefore wouldn't scale to each other in the same sense that Star Platinum scales to Crazy Diamond. The only actual realistic way to scale Golden Experience Requiem is roughly around King Crimson's level of power due to how much damage Diavolo and King Crimson took. But That's via Golden Experience Requiem using multiple barrages of punches while going all out. And it's not like he's just using his casual strength, unlike what some people might try and argue for. And due to how much effort Golden Experience Requiem was using to get Diavol to that point while trying to put him in an infinite death loop, it wouldn't necessarily scale GR above stands like Star Platinum or any other similar stands, physically speaking, for for reasons I've already gone into. But most of those ultimate stand statements or anything similar, people try to use to argue for Golden Experience Requiem, those ultimate stand statements are usually in reference to Goal Experience's return to zero ability, not his actual physical strength, since most guides that do use that phrase usually shows return to zero in action and not Golden Experience Requiem's Muda Muda Rush, really. And if you do want to scale Giorno off of Diavolo and use this weird like skill chain, then on an extreme high end, even if you want to wank Golden Experience Requiem and Diavolo off a little bit, then Giorno with GR is at most mountain level, or at least in the mountain level ranges in terms of just AP, via Silver Chariot's feats back in part 3 of deflecting these concentrated beams of light from the stand, the sun. And as I said earlier, due to the amount of light speed scaling or scaling far beyond that, Golden Experience Requiem most likely caps off at around the MFTL ranges. It wouldn't be too surprising for Golden Experience Requiem to scale that high as well. But as I said, most of these debunks of these scales people try and use are in that previous video I mentioned. So watch that video for a more in-depth and actually good explanation I give. But now let's talk about my fucking husband. When trying to understand fate scaling and how fate does actually present characters and their AP scaling, you need to understand the mechanisms of the games themselves and how the games rate the character's stats. Now, if you look at a lot of Astolfo's stats and parameters, at least the ones given to us for the writer class of the character, the games usually give Astolfo like a rank D in terms of strength as well as a rank B in terms of speed, which a B in speed in the context of Fate is very, very good. To understand the parameter within Fate and how it works, parameter rules are a set of rules basically just representing the relative power for each item ranked by letters under different systems and translated into specific parameters for no particular reason, quote unquote. And going from weakest to like the worst to the best, these five main ranks are E, D, C, B, and A. Uh, those are the more quantifiable numbers or ranks, and there are numbers assigned to it, considering one to be a normal value. To assume these ranks are quantifiable, E is equal to 10, and it only increases by 10 the more you go up and the closer you go to A. So A would be 50 in this context. This means that between each rank, there's a 10 times difference, and meaning that even the higher dimensional scaling other characters have performed can still somewhat apply to Astolfo just to a weaker degree in his own right. Because, well, he's on the weaker end of things. The reason I say that is just because you can't be 10 times stronger than someone and then have a whole ass another level of dimensional scaling. You need to be within the same level of dimensionality of in terms of power to be a 10 to 50 times difference, because to be on a whole different level of existence or like have different dimensional scaling, you need to be infinitely above the person or infinitely more complex in terms of your power in comparison to the other person. And considering how the binary rules and how it works, it wouldn't make sense just to be 10 times stronger and then have a whole ass different dimension, like dimensional tier above the person that you're comparing yourself to. So Astolfo still is within the same range of power to in comparison to a lot of these characters. And to actively understand a lot of fate scaling, you need to rely on the fate cosmology. Now, I will go over the fate cosmology like briefly, but if you want like a whole ass video of fate cosmology, you can just ask away. Like, I don't mind doing a fate related video. Now, first and foremost, to understand fate cosmology, every planet within the cosmology has and follows its own concepts and common sense. Rules that can apply to a specific planet doesn't necessarily apply to other planets, and not every Earth, quote unquote, is the same in the like verse, basically, which I will explain. In Fate, basically, every Earth has like separate realities, with some parallel worlds and other parallel beings being higher dimensions, and these are referred to as textures of reality. Textures play a fundamental role within the verse in separating myths from other myths. The existence of textures allows for all myths within the verse to exist without contradicting each other. Every myth takes place within its own texture of reality, such as Scandinavian myths and events such as Ragnarok, not necessarily contradicting, say, Egyptian mythology. That's why in Fate we have multiple sun gods slash goddesses, all existing on the same Earth without contradicting each other despite being from different mythologies. So, in short, Earth in itself isn't necessarily just a planet, but more of a threshold for multiple realities, hence the existence of different textures for various myths. And if we take a step back and look at the verse as a whole, parallel worlds are notions of human history that exist within the first texture of the world and the texture of humanity, which was like basically the blueprint of the universe and is and would insinuate to the universe as seen when characters use event storage to store the surface texture of the planet. And within the games, characters went inside that and ended up witnessing an infinitely sized universe and also having its own concepts. This first texture containing a universe also branches out into endless possibilities which exist as parallel worlds. These possibilities branch off one each other, and these infinite possibilities form the concept of human history, likely making it an infinite amount of universes or parallel worlds or whatever you want to interpret it. And there are also higher dimensions within Fate. Rin, one of the characters, explains how higher dimensions in the verse function. Higher dimensions and characters within these higher dimensions view like characters or beings or just history within these lower dimensions as if they were just a scroll and or a book. Really, it's just normal higher dimensional existence. BB, who obtained a higher dimensional presence, could view all of linear time and all of the multiverses within the moon cells as a book and can see the entire past, present, and future of lower dimensions basically at the same time. And within the world of Tsukihime, it is explained that a certain character gained higher dimensional senses, which was enough to make her basically omnipotent in the context of the lower realms or lower dimensions. But because her body was still lower dimensional, she was still at the mercy of the higher dimensional beings. Thus, she returned to her lower dimensional self and lost these higher dimensional senses. And throughout the like fake verse as a whole, like the bigger, if you look at the bigger picture, we got to look at certain things and have an idea on where these characters scale in to the cosmology of the verse. Take a look at moon cells, for example. The moon cell is a supercomputer created by alien slash non-human intelligent life, and it consists of 7 layers. And getting past them gets you to the moon cell's quote unquote core. And the moon cell was made to basically observe and record everything on Earth and about Earth since its very existence, basically. And there's other things regarding the moon cells, and it's like they're basically treated as an ultimate artificial world created within the moon cell, which records Earth, which has infinite possibilities as well. It basically holds just endless possibilities and if futures and infinite possible futures. But moving back to the moon cell, since that's what I want to focus on right now, the moon cell has like an eighth dimensional barrier, and it blocks the way to the moon cell's core. And the moon cell's quote unquote core is implied to be a higher dimension, making it likely ninth dimensional at least. But the characters who talk about the moon cells and likely the moon cell's core mention imaginary numbers space in reference to it. So you could also scale imaginary numbers of space to the moon cell's actual core to get a more accurate understanding to how overpowered and the moon cell is and how the characters scale to this in terms of dimensionality. So to understand them within the context of fate, basically the imaginary number of space contains all possibilities as well as all possibilities that can be basically thought of because it's not it's basically just not it can't be unseen. It can't be detected by the current existing laws of physics, the reality of real numbers, and imaginary numbers, which are mutually exclusive, untouchable, and cannot be observed each other and cannot really observe each other. The imaginary numbers of the space is a higher dimensional space made up of complex such imaginary numbers and is the source of poor information, and it is sometimes referred to as the garden fall from the sky. Within the far side, and reality itself is made up of real numbers, making imaginary numbers of space high hyperversal within the context of fate. Now, some people might still be asking, oh, how does Astolfo, the fucking pink haired femboy, scale this? Well, just hear me out real quick. Characters like BB, who I mentioned before, basically became the moon cell by absorbing the power, like giving her the same dimensionality as the core itself, and basically not only scaling her to the eighth to ninth dimensional ranges at a global, but also scaling her to the high hyperversal like meta I used earlier while mentioning the imaginary numbers. And you have servants such as Gilgamesh defeating BB, and even after BB became the moon cells, he still defeated her. And while yes, Gilgamesh is by all means stronger than Astolfo, and it's shown via the parameters where Astolfo, if when Gilgamesh, was given a B in strength compared to Astolfo's D I mentioned earlier. But as I said before I got into the cosmology of fate, due to the fact that the parameter and its set of rules has a scalable way to differentiate each rank, that being 10 times between each rank, that means like Astolfo would still be within the same level of dimensionality as Gilgamesh, making him, as in Astolfo, 8th to 9th D on a low end, while high hyperversal on a high end. Like as I said earlier, you can't just be 10 or even 100 times stronger than someone and have higher dimensional scaling at the same time. It would kind of contradict each other if you want to say that, oh, he has high dimensional scaling while also be 100 times stronger, and saying the other person is only galaxy level. You know what I mean? You'd need to have like be on this. You need to be on the same dimensional scale for you to be 100 times stronger compared to the other person. And as I said, this would just suggest that Astolfo is in the complex multiversal to high hyperversal ranges of power, but isn't necessarily as strong as Gilgamesh. So, Astolfo obviously is vastly above Giorno in terms of strength, durability, and most likely speed, but some people might wonder how Astolfo has a way to counter Giorno's return to zero ability. For those who aren't aware and aren't into JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Golden Experience Requiem's ultimate ability is to revert all actions and willpower to a state of zero, completely nullifying them and preventing them from becoming quote unquote real. For simplicity's sake, it's like performing a Control Z on a Word document or something, completely denying any form of causality. And this can be as direct as to oppose King Crimson, as shown when King Crimson's time erasure ability was reverted by Golden Experience Requiem. But the thing is, Return to Zero only falls on under lower end causality manipulation, but that doesn't necessarily answer how Astolfo can counter such an ability. Astolfo himself has multiple different ways to counter such an ability. One of the first ways is just due to his actual higher dimensional scaling. So the fact that he scales higher in terms of dimensionality is just a major reason why Return to Zero doesn't necessarily work on Astolfo. It's pretty self-explanatory, actually. Higher dimensional beings or characters with scaling that is on a higher dimensional scale are just infinitely more complex than characters on that previous dimension. So the fifth dimension is infinitely more complex than the fourth dimension, and that fourth dimension is infinitely more complex than the third, and so on. And the same can be applied here, making them automatically immune to lower dimensional hacks, or can just be flat out ignoring them and won't affect them. And another way for Astolfo to counter Giorno's abilities is via power nullification. Power nullification is a pretty common ability in fiction as a whole, and if Astolfo uses them, then Return to Zero doesn't necessarily work on him, and hence it doesn't work on his actions since Golden Experience Requiem affects the general scope of cause and not Giorno's causality. Hence, it cannot just return to zero his own actions and his own action of death, but has to RTZ the action of someone's attack. Due to certain physiology, Astolfo has power nullification, and also due to certain physiology, servants can actually nullify entire concepts as well, such as space and fate, not just someone's abilities. So, in conclusion, Astolfo not only is unironically a lot stronger than Giorno, but has ways to counter the majority of, if not every one of Giorno's abilities that he would realistically use in this matchup if we give Giorno Golden Experience Requiem. And even if you want to bring up Giorno's Infinite Death Loop, Giorno actively needs to hurt and or draw blood from his opponent. And considering Astolfo is just that fucking broken in comparison to Giorno, Giorno wouldn't necessarily be able to hurt him, let alone draw blood. So a pink-haired, 5'5" fucking twink of a boy bullies the shit out of one of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure's strongest characters.